Welcome back to Silicon Bytes. And we're going to look once again at the Alaska summit between Putin, Trump, and several of their ministers. But as we wait for new announcements and news to come out of the early sessions, we're going to look at things from a slightly different angle. What Z-Patriots think of the Alaska summit. The reaction of Russia's nationalists, the so-called turbo patriots and war bloggers, to Putin's Alaska summit with Trump is perhaps not what you might have expected. It's far from positive and strikes a note of caution, fear even, fear of humiliation, fear of failure, fear of treachery. What on earth is going on? Before we jump into that, thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee, and of course everyone who has supported the fundraising we've been doing for the 69th Sniffing Brigade to purchase a truck for Ukrainians at the front to help them survive, help them remain resilient. Now back into the episode. Ordinarily, we would not spend much time reviewing what Z-Patriots think because it is vile and inconsequential. But on this occasion, the negative murmurings around the summit are perhaps a little revealing, not of Russia's strengths, but a recognition of its weakness and vulnerability. They fear that the capacity for Russia to wage war may be dwindling and ending. What do Z-Patriots really think and what Putin wants? No greater humiliation. Why the Alaska summit rattles the Z sphere. On the eve of the Alaska summit, the Kremlin's online chorus of hate and loathing, the Z-Patriot milieu, sounds a little off-key. Russia's hardline pro-war influencers can't decide whether Alaska is a stage set for triumph or a setup for humiliation. Exiled dissident Russian journalist and YouTuber Michael Naki stitched together their reactions in a scathing roundup titled "Большого унижения придумать невозможно." You couldn't invent a greater humiliation. That's on the YouTube channel entitled Michael Naki and uploaded mid-August 2025. The gist from this Z-Sphere digest is that the summit is seen more as a triumph for the West and Ukraine than a set piece of political manipulation by the Putin regime. Some of them insist that Alaska is hostile terrain and proof the Kremlin is prepared to beg the West. Others spin it as an historical symmetry, a chance to reclaim dignity on land that Russia sold for a song in 1867. Most fear one thing, the optics. Even an image of Putin waiting on US soil looks like a concession in their minds. Well, this is extraordinary, as critics of Trump, of which I number myself one, have the very same impression, but from the other end of the telescope. The optics to a Western audience is that the summit is a major concession to Russia and a gift to the Russian president, a way of normalizing him as a legitimate statesman on the world stage and not a thuggish KGB spy and murderer running a mafia racket that just happens to be in control of an entire country. Meanwhile, the Kremlin's official line is all choreography and symbolism, down to references to Soviet graves in Alaska and the promise that no documents will be signed after the meeting. No documents are expected to be signed, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov cited by the Kiev Independent on August 14th, 2025. Well, the running order for the event and who's in the room really matters. Moscow has telegraphed its lineup with unusual force and clarity. The Russian delegation will include Ushakov, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Defense Minister Andrei Belousov, Finance Minister Anton Siluanov, and Russia Direct Investment Fund head Kirill Dmitriev, an advisor said, again quoted in the Kiev Independent. It's curious to note why a finance minister and an investment minister would come to an event nominally focusing on ending a war. But this is not only a war, and Trump is not versed in traditional diplomacy or negotiation techniques. If we were to translate or interpret Russia's line, it screams of politics, war, and money, geared towards a deal maker, Trump, whose brand is all about real estate and personal branding. But this is not about deal making per se. More, this whole event is designed to hold the attention of Trump, flatter his ego, and stretch out the time a little longer before punitive sanctions are imposed on Russia. It's an incredible exercise on a global scale of distraction and deflection. The venue is Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, a US military base in Alaska. After a one-on-one with translators, it goes into a five-on-five discussion. There is no official signing ceremony planned. This is just optics, press, and spin, so says the Kiev Independent. Well, Z-Patriots are saying what they fear out loud. In Naki's Alaska Roundup, Z-bloggers predict that Trump will bend Putin. In another fresh video, предприятие закрывается, стройка стала, денег нет. Enterprises are conceding that the war economy is cracking up. The consistent line throughout the commentary is the fear that a weak bargaining hand plus domestic strain in Russia equals dangerous concessions by Putin. It's telling when the regime's own cheerleaders describe the internal stresses in such a way. And of course, it tracks with Ukraine's strategic campaign of pressure being applied to the Russia war industries and the energy infrastructure. Drones and sabotage against Russia's oil infrastructure is raising the costs for Moscow dramatically, making it harder for them to sustain the war economy and to maintain the logistics that are an essential lifeline for the Russian army. The Palestine model rumors and the instant backlash. A cluster of reports claims the US and Russia discussed a West Bank style occupation template, borders de jure Ukrainian but de facto controlled by Russia. One blunt line captures the alleged pitch. It'll be just like how Israel occupies the West Bank, quoted in the Times. The White House, via multiple outlets, dismissed this as fake and sloppy reporting, so says Times of Israel. Even the rumor normalizes a permanent grey zone, however, exactly the outcome the Kremlin wants. It would launder occupation while dodging the words annexation and surrender, and it would allow Russia's regime of terror over the territories to continue with total impunity. But what does Putin want to get out of the Alaska summit, and what do Z-Patriots expect will happen? External reporting and Kremlin watchers are strikingly aligned. Symbolic legitimacy, sanctions, relief pathways, constraints on Ukraine's sovereignty, and a narrative that Trump tried but Ukraine refused to make peace. Analysts expect demands to include renouncing NATO, ceding or recognizing Russian gains, placing limits on Ukraine's military, and steps towards sanctions relief, positions Moscow hasn't budged on. This comes from a Reuters roundup and a PBS explainer. Most of this seems to be in alignment with what Moscow is looking for, at least it aligns with some of their demands. But what are the Z-Patriots saying about the risks of the summit? And why does this list of seemingly attractive wins for Moscow not really satisfy them? Well, Vladimir Solovyov, TV host, propagandist, all-round despicable human, says it's time to win, and they act like there's no war. On a Friday night, you go out into a big city and think, what's happening? Is there really a war somewhere? There is, and it's a terrible war, and we need to understand that very clearly, and unfortunately, it won't end for everyone just with a meeting in Alaska. Igor Strelkov Girkin, an imprisoned ex-DNR commander, and someone whose comments we have covered quite extensively on this channel, has also chipped in. Of course, the meeting isn't for nothing. I assume that friend Donald will try to bend friend Vladimir into a deal favourable to the US. I predict that the latest summit will end in chatter without concrete results. I expect no breakthroughs from the Anchorage meeting, nor a real ceasefire. Well, again, Strelkov, who is a thorn in the side of the regime, here says something which mostly I think I would agree with. Maxim Kalashnikov is a nationalist commentator, and his short injection into this is the preparation of the meeting means an agreement has already been reached. We're talking about a freeze along the line of contact. Interesting that Kalashnikov and Strelkov would have such an opposed view of the potential outcomes. Well, more of these quotes at the end. The more aware commentators on the Russian side understand Kiev's counter-moves and its potential impact on Russia's ability to wage war, keeping the pressure on Russia's infrastructure and keeping its allies close, avoiding the risks of Moscow's divide and conquer strategy. On the ground, Ukraine keeps pressure on Russian logistics, energy, and cash flow. Reuters on August 14th, 2025 quotes, fallen debris from Ukrainian drones caused a fire at an oil refinery in Russia's Volgograd refinery complex, the governor said on Thursday. So that's the pressure on the ground. And politically, Zelensky met UK PM Keir Starmer in London on the eve of the summit, tightening the European line, reinforcing support for real security guarantees and rejection of territorial carve-ups. We must not lose sight, however, of the human cost, what Russian peace feels like in numbers. As the Alaska summit looms, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine issued the grimmest monthly data since the first year of the invasion, with at least 1,674 civilian casualties, 286 killed, 1,388 injured. The number of civilian casualties continues to rise in July, setting a new record for monthly overall casualties since May 2022, and that is from the UN Human Rights Ukraine group. When negotiators speak of pauses, remember what was happening yesterday in Kharkiv, Odessa, Sumy. A ceasefire that cements lines under these conditions isn't peace, it's a form of administered violence. Well, history as a weapon, maps, myths, and the Z narrative. Kiev's Center for Countering Disinformation warned that Putin would present Trump with historical materials, maps that frame Ukraine as an artificial state. This was speculated in the Kiev Independent on August 14th, 2025. In the Z-Patriot universe, Alaska is a memory palace. It is Russian America, orthodoxy as the spiritual source of the territory. But Russia, in reality, possessed these lands less than half the time they have been American. But the point isn't scholarship, facts, and figures. It's mythic justification for a 21st century war, so suggests the Institute for the Study of War in a special piece they ran on the symbolism of holding the summit in Alaska. And there are a number of bargaining myths. Transactional Putin, minerals for peace, security guarantees. These are all things that will feature in the conversation. And three specific seductive myths hover over the Alaska summit, perhaps dooming it to produce no result and to be strategically inconsequential no matter what media headlines it drives. One, that Putin is transactional and can be bought. External assessments from ISW to Reuters suggest the exact opposite. Putin's war aims haven't shifted one bit. Pauses are operational. They're not moral or political. So says CSIS and Reuters. Number two, minerals for peace is something that Putin will be interested in. Even floated hypotheticals about resource tie-ups miss the reality that Moscow wants political capitulations, not profits, so says the Times, i.e. it wants to erase Ukraine. It's not interested in rational economic outcomes. And three, that vague security guarantees will do. NATO should not be part of those security guarantees, French President Emmanuel Macron said after a leader's call with Trump, while adding the US and willing allies should be part of them. Reported by Reuters, August 14th, 2025. The open question is efficacy. Without hard deterrence, a paper umbrella won't keep out the artillery shells raining down. There is nothing concrete here in the announcement so far that will scare the Russians or deter aggression from Moscow against Ukraine or even Europe. Trump told reporters he believes Putin's ready to cut a deal. I believe he's now convinced that he's going to make a deal. He's going to make a deal. Yes, I think he's going to, said Trump. Quoted by the Kiev Independent, August 14th. But based on what? Surely not facts, evidence, and experience. It's a feeling then, a feeling that Trump has, a feeling in the moment, a hope or perhaps just empty words that twist and turn in the air and will come out differently tomorrow or even in a few hours' time. Belief is not a strategy when dealing with a KGB thug intent on victory. But justice is not optional. Stolen children, ICC warrants, and the line that cannot move. Any settlement that skips accountability is a deferral of justice, not an ending. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova for the unlawful deportation and transportation of Ukrainian children. That's from an ICC press release, March 17th, 2023. Independent reporting, Reuters, AP, and Yale's research documents the machinery of deportations and re-education, brainwashing, if you want to call it that. This is not a side issue. It is the moral center of the war, but it does not feature in the comments, tweets, or announcements of Trump, and we cannot be sure it will even come onto the agenda during the Alaska summit. So here's a bottom line summary for Alaska. Freezing Ukraine's borders does not solve the problem and does not create an environment for justice, sustainable peace, or viable security, and in no way would lead to any kind of reconciliation. Victims don't get locked out of the room on such occasions, but that's what's happening here. We should be concerned by the exclusion of Ukraine from the summit, as well as their core allies in Europe, who monetarily have provided in the region of 2 times more military and economic aid to Ukraine than the US has in the last 4 years. This goes absolutely counter to the endless regurgitation of lies on this topic by Trump. If Alaska ends with optics and ambiguity, expect the Z-Patriots to spin it either way, but the measure of success isn't the mood of state-sponsored nationalists and fascists, it's whether a sovereign democratic Ukraine gets security that deters the aggressor, gets justice that endures, and has their agency, has their voice recognized in getting to decide their own future. Well, that's the main concluding part of the episode, but we are going to quote more of the Z blogger community to wrap up because I think it's interesting to understand what they're writing and saying about this. And we're also going to have some additional quotes taken from the Michael Nucky breakdown episode of Z Patriots and Russian commentators. Well, we have to start with Alexander Dugin, ideologue and genocide inciting gobshite. There is still a chance of some kind of positive shift, he says, but these circumstances and balance of power do not support optimistic expectations, and Alaska is US territory, not neutral. Moreover, it is our former territory. The symbolism is so-so. However, it's worth flying to Alaska only if victory awaits. Russia's negotiating principle is this: we concede nothing, we take everything. If need be, we simply keep advancing. Kiev must be punished exemplarily and harshly. Well, in the context of this comment from Dugin, we can see that any perceived concessions by Putin would go down very badly with this community, though whether they can express that publicly is highly debatable. Alexander Konkov, a pro-Kremlin political scientist, said, "Success at the Alaska meeting is less about public agreements than one-on-one understandings about the rules of the game." Interesting. What are the rules of this game, though, we have to ask? For Russia, it seems to be what is ours, and what is yours is up for grabs. In fact, what's yours is not really yours, and in truth, it never was. We also quote here from Lev Vershinin, "It's impossible to invent a greater humiliation. Alaska, in terms of symbolism, is a very poor choice, because Alaska is former Russian land." And here's a breakdown of a few more commentators. Miroslav Minskaya, who is Strelkov's wife, says, "The very idea of a meeting in Alaska has very strange symbolism. For Russia, this place is a symbol of the voluntary loss of its own territory." The Russian People's Squad, Ruska Narodna Druzhina, says, "Symbols rule the world. It's very symbolic that Uncle Donald invited our most illustrious to Alaska, as if hinting what was yours is now ours. To meet in Alaska and not, say, Guantanamo, Alaska was sold symbolically, showing that territories can be bought and sold. The meeting isn't on neutral ground, but in the US, and not in the capital, but in the backwoods, in places that used to be ours, and we squandered them on the cheap for next to nothing." Defender of Tula, Zashitnik Tilyakov, says, "This bloody performance, which has lost even a hint of meaning, will end as suddenly as it began. I wonder, is he referring to the summit or is he hinting at the pointlessness of the entire war strategy? Roman Alechin is another pro-Kremlin commentator and says these are talks between two powers whose arsenals can wipe cities off the map. There they will decide who becomes the new center of power and in how many years. This perhaps gets to the essence of what Putin wants to achieve and what many Russians want to see. The world divided between a handful of so-called great powers, with Russia as a peer adversary, feared, not mocked, or worse, ignored. A nuclear power at the height of its capability on the world stage, begrudgingly respected and carving up the world in a Yalta with the US. What a sad vision, and what a ludicrous, pointless desire that is shared by so many Russians, and how at variance with the reality it is of Russia as a small third-rate provincial town that just happens to have a large nuclear arsenal and a monumental chip on its shoulder. Well, that's it for this episode. The summit will pass, and I'll be very surprised if it ends in an agreement to implement a ceasefire. The odds are stacked against this, and all evidence of Putin's behavior suggests that this is not even on his agenda. For our part in the democratic West, we need to stop advising Ukraine to surrender land and start compelling Russia to give it back. Only then will this horror stop.